On the day Barry Gibb received his knighthood from Prince Charles in 2018, everyone present believed they were witnessing the final glorious moment of a music legend. But as he bowed his head to accept the ceremonial sword, Barry broke down in tears. Not out of pride, but because he was the only one left to receive it. The three brothers who once rewrote the history of popular music with him were gone. Maurice died suddenly from intestinal blockage, Robin passed away in agonizing pain from cancer, and Andy was lost at just 30 years old. The Bee Gees, the band that sold more records than anyone except the Beatles, had been reduced to a single surviving member, Barry, the last man standing. So why did a family so gifted that it defined an entire era have to pay with mysterious deaths, relentless losses, and one man carrying all the memories alone? Was their monumental success a curse, or did the tragedy begin long before the spotlight, when a young boy who nearly died from a boiling water accident grew up believing he had to save his entire family with music? This isn't just the story of the man who wrote Staying Alive. It is the journey of someone who had to learn how to keep living when everyone who mattered had already gone. And what keeps him going today? Is it glory or grief? The truth didn't begin on stage, but in a cramped room where scalding steam turned a 2-year-old boy into a challenger of death for the first time in his life. Before becoming the falsetto voice of an entire generation, Barry Gibb was just a child born on September 1st, 1946, on the Isle of Man, raised among damp railway flats, nights when money ran out, and a constant fear that his family could fall apart at any moment. His father, Hugh Gibb, made a living playing drums in seaside hotels, a job with no fixed salary, dependent on luck and the pockets of strangers. His mother, Barbara, patched meals together and hid her anxiety behind a smile so the children wouldn't see the nights she agonized over every penny left. That home had little to offer besides music and hope, yet music, like some peculiar destiny, arrived hand in hand with disaster. The day Barry reached for a teapot on the stove and boiling water spilled down his body, the family thought fate had spoken. Doctors at Noble's hospital gave him just 20 minutes of hope. His chest and arm were burned so severely they doubted he'd survive. But Barry lived, not through some simple miracle, but like someone who had silently declared war on fate. The scars that never faded became his earliest memory of pain, survival, and a family that refused to surrender. Barely escaping death's scythe, Barry soon confronted another ghost, insecurity born from a life in constant upheaval. The family moved again and again, Snell Road, then Manchester, not to chase dreams, but to outrun poverty breathing down their necks. In those restless journeys, his father's drums and his brother's voices became the only refuge. No toys, no safety, no anchors, just music and the hope that something might finally change. It was in that uncertainty that the seed of the Bee Gees was planted. Not from ambition to be superstars, but from the instinct to survive. Barry discovered something he would never be able to escape for the rest of his life. Music wasn't a choice. It was the only exit. And when a child turns fear into sound, that sound is never just melody, it becomes proof of survival. But that escape had only just begun. The voices of three brothers would not remain confined to a poor home in Manchester. They would carry those voices across a fateful migration, onto dusty stages in far-off Australia, and transform childhood pain into a global musical empire. Childhood scars didn't just mark Barry Gibb's skin. They carved themselves deep into his fear of poverty, constantly lurking behind him. That silent pressure pushed the young boy into turning his voice into a means of survival, long before anyone imagined glittering dreams of fame. Just as the family finally settled after countless moves, 11-year-old Barry gathered Robin, Maurice, and a few neighborhood kids to form the Rattlesnakes. Their small-town performances, covering Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly in local halls, brought no fame, but they gave Barry something his childhood had stolen, the feeling that he could control something. Back then, music was a lifeline, not a passion. One night, the family's only guitar snapped in half. The sound of splintering wood wasn't just an accident. It was a cruel reminder that poverty could crush even hope. With no money to replace it, the band fell apart. But instead of despairing, Barry reacted like someone who had already learned the art of survival. He formed another group, renamed it Wee Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats, entered talent shows, and played music in exchange for bread and a handful of coins. For the first time, Barry understood a truth that would shape his entire life. If you want to survive, music can't just be beautiful. It has to be useful. When the family decided to leave England in 1958, they didn't carry grand dreams. Australia simply sounded like a place where breathing was easier. Aboard the ship Fairsea, surrounded by battered suitcases, seasick passengers, and the weary eyes of immigrants, Barry realized he was gambling his entire future. Once they reached Redcliffe, reality struck. Poverty had followed them, only now accompanied by scorching dust and the smell of gasoline. The Gibb brothers sang at motorcycle racetracks for audiences who hadn't come for music, raising their voices above roaring engines as though every note was a dare against destiny. No stage, no spotlight, only dirt, smoke, and an aching need to break free. Life's brutality pushed Barry toward a decision no ordinary teenager would consider. He dropped out of school at 15. He believed textbooks couldn't pull his family out of misery, but music could. It wasn't impulsive rebellion. It was the choice of someone who knew failure wasn't an option. From that day on, Barry wrote songs as if each one were a ticket out. By 1963, those efforts cracked open their first door. The Bee Gees signed with Festival Records in Sydney and released their first singles. Wine and Women unexpectedly hit radio airwaves, and the Battle of the Blue and the Gray drew media attention. The turning point came when Barry's composition, I Was a Lover, a Leader of Men, won a songwriting prize. Critics, who had dismissed them as teen fluff, were forced to acknowledge Barry as a songwriter of substance. Yet Australia was too small for ambitions born from those dusty Redcliffe nights. Barry felt the paradox tightening around him. He had escaped poverty, but now found himself trapped by the country's limits. His songs no longer belonged to makeshift racetrack stages. They demanded a world stage. That pressure pushed Barry toward the most reckless decision of his life, returning to England, where every door could either open or slam shut. In 1966, the Gibbs landed in London with less money than it took to rent a room, but with something no record label could ignore: a suitcase full of demos, songs honed in Redcliffe and shaped in the bare-bones studios of Sydney. They weren't just compositions. They were proof Barry was ready for the big leagues. Meeting Robert Stigwood was a collision of fate. The man with an eye for prodigies instantly recognized what Australia had failed to see. The Bee Gees weren't just another youth act. They were the opening gunshot of a new era. A Polydor contract followed, and soon New York mining disaster 1941 hit the airwaves. Its strange melodies, fragile vocals, and cinematic storytelling fooled listeners into thinking it was a new Beatles track. That confusion wasn't bad luck. It was the ticket that placed Bee Gees at the heart of the British pop map. From there, the hits arrived like chapters in a melancholy diary. Massachusetts topped the UK charts, Robin on lead vocals, Barry shaping the melody beneath it, forging a sound that blended loneliness with a hunger for escape. To love somebody, words, I've got to get a message to you. I started a joke. Songs whispered like confessions from a generation lost in transition. They didn't shout to be heard. They made the world go silent to listen. But the cost of becoming the voice of sorrow was another sorrow. Bee Gees were no longer three brothers singing to outrun poverty. They were swallowed by relentless touring, endless studio nights, and crushing expectations from labels, the press, and fans. Barry and Robin, two strong egos, two fragile souls, collapsed from exhaustion on a flight. It was the first sign that music wasn't just binding them, it was tearing them apart. Everything exploded in 1969 when the label chose "First of May," Barry's song, as the single over "Lamplight," Robin's pick. To outsiders, it was a business choice. To Robin, it was betrayal, the world declaring his voice the shadow behind Barry's. He quit. The Bee Gees were reduced to Barry and Maurice. But the sound felt hollow, like a chair missing a leg, still standing but trembling. Barry tried proving he could stand alone. His solo project, The Kids No Good, was completed, and I'll Kiss Your Memory released, only to meet a frozen market. No one wanted a solitary Barry. The public loved him only in the harmony of three brothers, in melody scarred by shared wounds, not as a genius trapped in an empty room. The album was shelved forever, a brutal reminder that no matter how gifted he was, Barry couldn't escape a destiny woven in family strings. Then the impossible happened. Not a phone call, not a hit, but silence, pushing them back together. In late 1970, the three men who once swore they'd never face each other again reunited in the same studio. There was no winner or loser, only wounds that needed healing. Out of that came Lonely Days and How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? Their first US #1 wasn't a commercial triumph. It was a confession written in blood. They had tried going separate ways and discovered that without each other, they were nothing. It wasn't merely a reunion, it was surrender to a brutal truth. To Barry Gibb, the Bee Gees weren't a band. They were the breath that kept him alive. And just when everything seemed to fall back into place, fate was preparing the most dramatic turn in pop history, where one falsetto voice would change the world. The reunion wasn't a key to paradise. It was merely a ticket to continue. After How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, the Bee Gees found themselves suspended in a strange limbo. They had proven that brotherhood was stronger than collapse, yet their music was beginning to lag behind the restless innovations of the 1970s. Barry felt the weight of doubt pressing in, from the industry, from critics, and most terrifying of all, from within himself. The emotional ballads that once defined them were now seen as relics of a bygone era. The Bee Gees faced the risk of becoming a name people remembered, but no longer cared to hear. In that fear, Barry understood something most artists never dare confront. To survive, they had to abandon the version of themselves the world thought they were. The escape began somewhere no one expected: Miami. A city of blazing sun, humid salt air, and a hedonistic rhythm worlds away from Britain's gray solemnity. The Bee Gees placed their fate in the hands of a man who could turn feelings into sound: Arif Mardin. The atmosphere in the Miami studio stripped away every old habit. In what seemed like an accidental moment, Barry let out a high, piercing note, not as a vocal flourish, but as a release of pressure trapped inside his lungs. Instead of discarding it, Mardin kept it, and that captured sound became the falsetto that would redefine the Bee Gees. It wasn't technique. It was the voice of a soul pushed to the edge. Main Course 1975 detonated like a cannon blast. Jive Talkin' and Nights on Broadway transformed the Bee Gees from balladeers into the architects of a new musical language. Thick bass lines, deep grooves, rhythms that flowed like asphalt heat, and a voice that seemed to shatter ceilings. The mockery once aimed at them gave way to astonishment. Barry no longer wrote to preserve a legacy. He wrote as if each song was proof that the Bee Gees weren't just alive. They were evolving. When Children of the World unleashed You Should Be Dancing, the public finally understood. The Bee Gees weren't chasing disco, they were leading it. But that was only the overture. The real earthquake hit when Robert Stigwood signed them on for a modest-sounding project. Music for a film about Brooklyn youth. No one expected that a few days in the studio would produce a cultural monument. Stayin' Alive throbbed with the heartbeat of a city. Night Fever flickered like a neon rash through the night. How Deep Is Your Love returned to the confessional emotional terrain the Bee Gees had claimed as their own, love as the most beautiful pain a human can endure. Saturday Night Fever wasn't an album. It was a cultural detonation. Over 40 million copies sold, charts conquered, a global monument forged. Disco ceased being a genre. It became a lifestyle. And Barry Gibb became the man turning its gears. Few groups in pop history have ever written, produced, and performed 6 consecutive #1 hits under the same name. The Bee Gees were no longer artists. They were the center of the universe. Yet in this storm of glory, an old fear crept back. Barry had once used music to escape poverty. Now music gave him no exit. The peak was too high, too fast, and Barry felt swallowed by the very light he had created. The Bee Gees reached the summit every band dreamed of. But behind the spotlight, a chasm was forming, ready to pull them into one of the darkest chapters in pop history. A revolt against disco was coming, and the biggest name atop the charts was about to become the first target. The zenith of Saturday Night Fever was so blinding that no one noticed the shadow growing behind it. The worship of the Bee Gees was so feverish, so sudden, that when the crash came, the world seemed eager to destroy the empire it once adored. The irony was brutal. Barry didn't collapse when disco died. He reinvented himself by stepping behind other voices. The requests began raining in from superstar after superstar. Barbra Streisand came to Barry, not for a song, but for an emotional universe. Guilty weaponized her dramatic voice, and Woman in Love became a declaration. Dionne Warwick received Heartbreaker, later hailed as proof that Barry understood the female heart better than most women themselves. Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton entered the studio, and Islands in the Stream was born. Not just a hit, but a cross-genre cultural artifact. Many listeners adored these songs without knowing the man behind them was Barry Gibb, a figure they had dismissed as a washed-up disco king. His tiny songwriting credits were his sweetest revenge. Prejudice can burn trends, but it cannot erase craft. But society does not easily forgive the icons it once enthroned. When the Disco Sucks movement erupted, stages became battlegrounds drenched in resentment. Thousands of records were hurled, stomped, and burned in the horrific disco demolition night. The victim wasn't disco alone. It was the Bee Gees. The very name that had symbolized liberation now became an effigy of contempt. Radio abandoned them. The press blamed them. Their album, Living Eyes, an attempt to move beyond disco, fell into a silence colder than failure. The betrayal imprinted itself on Barry like a scar, a slap delivered by the same voices that once sang his words. Time shifted again. Pop culture grew tired of worshiping novelty and began looking backward, with clarity this time. The Bee Gees became pioneers, not caricatures. Critics dissected their catalog and uncovered the architecture of their harmonies, the craftsmanship of their melodies. the things that could never be burned in a stadium. In 1997, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame carved their names among immortals. In 2002, the brothers received CBEs, royal insignia for a journey once spat upon. But beneath the restored glory lay a fracture no metal could mend. Barry's body began to revolt. Arthritis kept him from standing too long. His hands no longer embraced the guitar with ease. The 1994 tour collapsed, not from lack of fans, but because Barry's body could no longer endure the weight of the life he built. The bitter irony was clear. The man who had dragged the Bee Gees out of fire was now imprisoned by pain, and the real losses were still to come. Maurice's death in 2003 ended the Bee Gees as a living entity. Barry continued alone, then briefly alongside Robin, until fate robbed him once more in 2012. Alone on stage, Barry no longer tried to ignite crowds. He stood facing a space once filled by three familiar voices. Music once more became refuge. In the Now, 2016, felt like an unspoken dialogue between a man and the remains of his family's legacy. Greenfield's 2021 wasn't nostalgia. It was an act of inheritance, letting others carry voices no longer alive. Barry now guides the Bee Gees biopic, as if repaying the past by telling it truthfully, fully, no longer warped by the old prejudice. No pop artist has ever lived a tragedy arc as complete as Barry Gibb's, from holding the pulse of the world to becoming its scapegoat, to living long enough to watch history kneel before what it once mocked. Yet behind every honor reclaimed remains one story still unfinished, the story of the last man standing on a vast stage, with no one left to harmonize beside him. After countless nights wrestling with stage lights, smoky studios, and pounding bass lines, Barry Gibb found in Maureen Bates something every exhausted soul secretly longs for: an anchor. They met in the late 1960s when the Bee Gees were still searching for direction, reinventing themselves, and trying to remember who they were. Maureen wasn't chasing fame, wasn't a singer, wasn't part of show business. She was simply an ordinary girl who arrived in Barry's life like a cool breeze after a storm. At that moment, Barry needed a home, something to cling to if everything outside collapsed. They married while Barry was still wrestling with his artistic identity, long before the spotlight pointed directly at their family and while music remained a dangerous gamble. That marriage gave Barry something priceless: stability, a quiet corner amid chaos. Guitars shimmered, songs soared, records sold, fans screamed. But there was one person waiting for him at home, not because of platinum albums or fame, but because he was the man who whispered poems, melodies, and sometimes apologies after long nights on tour. But fame is never satisfied, not even with peace. Endless tours, relentless studio sessions, nights too long to count. Maureen slowly lost sight of the man she married. In his place stood someone who seemed to exist only backstage or beneath the spotlight. The fragile simplicity of marriage was no match for a life lived at full volume. The quiet rhythm she craved clashed with Barry's obsession. He wasn't chasing happiness, he was chasing the spotlight. They separated around 1970, just as the Bee Gees began their metamorphosis into disco icons. No scandals, no public battles, just two people quietly walking away while the world roared around them. Maureen left, with memories of the boy who sang melodies into her life. Barry stayed behind with his guitar, lyrics, and an avalanche of deadlines. His heart didn't shatter, but the fragile foundation of normalcy did. Later, as he stood beneath the glitter of fame, Barry realized something cruel. Fame can give you everything, while taking away the only peace you ever wanted. The image of him basking in applause, lights blazing, crowds roaring, none of it could fill the silent, dark room waiting after every tour. And in that silence, Linda Gray entered, not as fireworks, but as a quiet, devastatingly gentle light. She didn't see a superstar. She saw a tired man, desperate for warmth. Their love didn't grow from glamour. It grew from the hunger to heal. Linda accepted the silence, the loneliness, and the heavy shadows that forever follow an artist. When the Bee Gees stood at their highest peak, when the studio overflowed with noise, Linda was behind the curtain, catching every consequence fame left behind. The endless absences, the missed promises, the exhaustion. Yet she stayed, convinced that music was never worth the cost of a broken family. Her devotion built something no fame could replicate. A real home, a world where Barry was not a star but a husband and eventually a father. Over the years, Linda gave Barry 5 children, each one a new dream, a new piece of hope Barry once believed he'd lost. The stage lights dimmed, the tours slowed, but the house echoed with the sound of laughter, hesitant guitar strings by the porch, and the crackle of aging joints as Barry's fingers still reached for his instrument. When the Bee Gees ended, when his brothers were taken one by one, Linda became the force that kept Barry from collapsing into guilt and grief. Suddenly, fame and fortune meant nothing without the warmth of home, without someone who saw the man behind the music. Linda helped Barry remember a truth buried beneath decades of applause. Music comes from the heart, and the heart must be loved, not consumed. In the quiet of their Miami estate, surrounded by time's scars and a colossal musical legacy, the world sees a man more human than ever. Tired, aching, sometimes losing his falsetto, yet still alive, still loving, still keeping promises to his children and to the woman who stayed long after the lights went out. When music no longer defined him, Linda and their family became the place he finally understood he belonged, not as the illustrious Sir Barry Gibb, but as a husband and father who never stopped trying. Barry once believed that music, if beautiful enough, powerful enough, sincere enough, could hold people together. But the Gibb family was never just a band. It was a choir suspended between love and fate. And when the first cracks appeared, they weren't born from the charts. They came from the place where Barry was weakest, family. Andy entered Barry's life like another chapter of himself, a younger, more reckless, more dazzling, and far more dangerous version. The 12-year age gap turned Barry into half-brother, half-father. Every melody Barry wrote for Andy was like a map, hoping to guide him far without letting him get lost. When Barry placed a guitar in Andy's hands, when he patiently fixed every lyric, every note in the studio, he wasn't just creating music. He was creating the belief that someone else could carry the family's dream further. "I just want to be your everything," and shadow dancing exploded. Andy was handsome, radiant, and utterly unprepared for the spotlight. The cheers made him a global phenomenon, but beneath the glow was a darkness Barry failed to see in time. Behind the stage, where Andy stood alone, swallowed by noise, numbing himself with cocaine and alcohol just to feel loved, was a place Barry had no idea how to rescue him from. Each time Andy called in panic, Barry gathered whatever strength he had left, pulled him back from the ledge, sent him to rehab, hoping the next time would be different. But music can resurrect a song. It cannot resurrect a heart rotted by addiction. On March 10th, 1988, just 5 days after his 30th birthday, Andy died in silence. The funeral had no music, only the motionless figures of men who once made the world dance. Barry, the man whose falsetto soared over pop music, couldn't produce a single note before his brother's photo. It wasn't just a death. It was the moment Barry realized that glory sometimes arrives so early that no one survives it. Before that wound could scar, another name struck him. Hugh Gibb, the man whose drum beat scored Barry's childhood. To the world, Hugh's death in 1992 was a quiet end to an ordinary life. To Barry, it was the last knock on the door of youth. No more his father's rhythms echoing in shabby rooms. No more a silent anchor whenever the brothers fought. Barry felt his family unravel like a song stripped of its harmony. Then came the blow no one expected. In January 2003, Maurice, the peacemaker, the laughter, the glue that kept Barry and Robin facing each other even when they were furious, went to the hospital with what seemed like a minor stomach ache. Hours later, doctors diagnosed a severe intestinal blockage. After the next surgery, Maurice's heart stopped. No farewell, no preparation, only the frozen silence of a melody abruptly cut. Barry didn't cry. He didn't rage. He didn't understand. A part of the Bee Gees' harmony vanished, and with it, the last support beam of the Gibb family. If Andy was the first crack, Maurice was the fracture that could never be repaired. In that moment, Barry faced the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Sometimes the one who keeps time is not the drummer, but the person who makes everyone else feel less alone. The silence after Maurice's death didn't just end a chapter of their career. It taught Barry that music might save the world, but no one is strong enough to save the people they love from their own destinies. When the applause faded and the spotlight illuminated only him, Barry faced the battle no song could prepare him for, watching everyone he loved disappear. One string of the family instruments snapped at a time. Losing Andy was the first blow. Losing Hugh knocked the rhythm off course. Maurice's death erased the glue. But Robin was the kill shot. Slow, invisible, merciless. Robin didn't die in a single dramatic night. Cancer of the colon, creeping into the liver, stretched the goodbye into a slow, dripping torture. Every time hope flickered, the disease came back harder, as if fate wanted both brothers to suffer through the illusion of rescue. Barry sat beside Robin's bed, sometimes holding his hand in silence, no longer talking about fame or records, just recalling the rehearsals at Redcliffe Speedway, the hungry nights in England, the first songs written half in fear, half in innocence. The man who once held the world with his falsetto now whispered those same notes. How deep is your love, trying to keep a soul from slipping away. But illness doesn't answer with music, only with breaths growing thinner. On May 20th, 2012, Robin died at 62. His funeral was wrapped in "I Started a Joke," a song once dismissed as irony, now a prophecy for its own author. Barbara, the mother who once held her 6 sons in damp rentals, clutched Robin's portrait as though her tears were exhausted. She had raised 3 boys who leaned on each other to climb the world, and now she had buried each of them. When Barry placed his hand on Robin's coffin, he didn't just lose his brother. He lost the final harmony that made his life audible. From that moment on, every step on stage felt like walking through emptiness. Barry went home, looked in the mirror, and finally understood the weight of the title, Last Man Standing. To the world, it was a crown. To him, it was a sentence. To live is to remember. 4 years later, in 2016, Barbara Gibb passed away. To the world, she was the mother of the Bee Gees. To Barry, she was the last witness of his beginning, the only person who remembered the boy who nearly died from boiling water, who hummed melodies before he knew who he was destined to become. When she closed her eyes, Barry said it felt like the last leaf on the tree. Only he remained to tell a story whose characters had departed before it ended. Yet amid all this ruin, something did not collapse. Barry and Linda's family. Not a family brandished before tabloids, not a breeding ground for scandal, just a home where Barry wasn't a legend, but a man who needed love. Stephen toured with him, Ashley and Travis stayed close to music. Michael chose his own quiet path, and Alexandra was shielded from the spotlight. Barry, guarding the fragments of memory he refused to let the world devour. At night, Barry plays acoustic guitar for his grandchildren. Linda looks at him not as a woman who married a star, but as someone who chose to stay beside a heart carved full of scars. That living legacy means more to Barry than platinum records or knighthood, a family untouched by the violence of fame, a place where he is no longer the last one standing, but the one who still has a reason to stay standing. Music took Barry to the summit, but family, broken, wounded, unfinished, kept him tethered to life. Not to be glorified, but so he would not become the final, lonely note of a harmony that once shook the world. Barry's life today does not resemble a triumphant new chapter. It feels more like the quiet rest after a long symphony, where the crescendos have been so overwhelming that a man no longer wishes to stand beneath the lights. After laying to rest 3 brothers and both parents, he withdrew from the noise of the world and chose Miami as his final harbor, a place of warm sun, ocean waves, and enough silence to breathe without being strangled by the past. Here, Barry spends most of his time with Linda Gray, the woman who has walked beside him for more than half a century, from the days when fame was merely a promise to the years when it became a shadow heavy enough to crush everything it touched. In the afternoons, he sits in his private studio, not to chase chart-topping hits anymore, but to ensure that the melodies which once took the Bee Gees to the top of the world do not fade into dusty memories. That spirit led him to Greenfields. The Gibb Brothers Songbook Vol. 1 in 2021, a country collaboration that revived timeless classics in a new voice. It wasn't a comeback. It was a ritual, a way to let his brothers' souls keep singing in another era. Barry no longer tours relentlessly or graces every media outlet, but that doesn't mean he abandoned music. Friends say he will occasionally pick up a guitar and play a fragment of To Love Somebody or How Deep Is Your Love for his grandchildren, as if checking whether his heart still beats in the old rhythm. In those moments, Barry is not a legend, not the brain of disco, but simply a grandfather with an acoustic guitar, passing on the one treasure the world once stole from him, the value of connection, of family, of harmonies that can never be replaced. In his 70s, Barry no longer seeks applause. He guards the Bee Gees' legacy the way one protects fragile artifacts, carefully, sparingly, sometimes so quietly that people assume he has left the stage of life. But that silence is not an ending. It is a rest, a long rest, so that when he eventually sings one last note, whether in his living room beside Linda or at some honorary tribute, the world will finally understand what Barry spent a lifetime proving. Music may create legends, but love and loss are what make a human being immortal. Barry Gibb's legacy does not reside solely in platinum records or statistics. It exists elsewhere, in the harmony millions recognize after a single beat, in the way he turned falsetto into a weapon, the studio into a battlefield, and 3 brothers into a cultural phenomenon. People can debate the disco era, mock the curls or the white suit, but no one can deny this. Popular music after the 1970s was never the same once the Bee Gees touched it. Hundreds of artists, from Michael Jackson, Prince, and Justin Timberlake to BTS, carry creative DNA he planted, bass lines that hit the heart, choruses written as if he already knew how the world would breathe along with them. Among songwriters, he stands nearly alone. A man who dominated charts, defined a genre, and delivered hits to artists whose mistakes made headlines. The world may call the Bee Gees the face of disco, but music scholars use another term. Architects who built songs the entire planet could dance to. The paradox is that Barry never saw himself as a legend. His whole life, he stood half a step behind the spotlight, letting Robin sing the sorrow, Maurice carry the harmony, Andy embody the unfinished dream. He was only truly visible when all of them were gone. When the Hall of Fame echoed with the Bee Gees' name, Barry walked on stage alone, not with pride, but with the eyes of a man who finally understood that his greatest victory had turned into his greatest loneliness. That is the tragedy that gives his legacy its depth, a life proving that glory is not a reward, it is the price. Barry Gibb won everything, charts, eras, expectations, yet he carries the wound of being the last survivor. He didn't choose the role, but he must live it. And today, whenever a Bee Gees song plays anywhere in the world, whether on a massive stage or a family gathering, people do more than sing. They move, they smile, and they feel an emotion no one can fully explain. Joy intertwined with sorrow, as if the music itself is crying on their behalf. It is one of the rare things time cannot kill. Barry once stood before tens of thousands. Now he stands alone in a quiet room. Yet music remains, unchanged, unwavering, unjudging. And because of that, he doesn't fade like a dying star. He exists like a tone history cannot delete. Barry Gibb survived fame, survived platinum, survived the grief that carved into him again and again. He wrote immortal melodies for millions. But who will write the ending for a life where he is the only one left? Share your thoughts, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe because there are many more stories waiting to be told before the memory of a generation disappears into silence.